25. Okay, we're back. And it's also our first Frontiers in Child Health Research seminar for the year as well. I want to start with our land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that UCSF sits upon, their home. We're proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ramaytush Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Nicki Bush, who is our chief of the Division of Developmental Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics. Nicki is an internationally recognized leader in understanding how social determinants of health impact child development. Her research investigates how adversity, beginning in utero, influences health across the lifespan. By exploring the interplay of biology and context, Dr. Bush aims to identify points for prevention and intervention, particularly for vulnerable populations. Today, she'll share with us her insights from her groundbreaking work on mitigating the intergenerational impact of toxic stress. Dr. Bush, welcome.
Thank you. Special thanks to those of you guys who came in person. It's always nice to have some humans on the scene. It's a privilege to talk to my colleagues and peers, and thank you guys for inviting me. I like to start when I'm speaking in medicine contexts to remind folks that around half of the variability in health outcomes is actually predicted by social and environmental factors. And I think a lot of times when we're in medicine, we forget that. Our roles in medicine are critically important, but it's actually a relatively small proportion of the variance in disease. And that half is mostly made up of social factors. And social factors today, I'm going to focus on a little bit, are things related to the community and social context, and dig into that a little bit to help us think about what role they might be playing in the children and families we see. And people are increasingly aware that early life stress gets under the skin. This has become a little bit catchier and more commonplace in understanding, in large part due to efforts in California and our California Surgeon General, Nadine Burke Harris, who helped popularize this construct, but it's been around for quite a bit in the field of psychology. And in pediatrics, it became popularized and larger in medicine when the Felitti and Onda studies around adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, looking at abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, including things such as interpersonal violence in the home, substance abuse, mental illness, and incarceration of family members, can lead to all sorts of health outcomes. And in particular, there's this dose-response relationship with more than 40 different health outcomes that have been replicated thousands of times. And so this is something to be understood as well known. And yet what's less well known is kind of how this happens. And so my work when I came to UCSF in 2007 was really to unpack some of that, to start thinking about, well, how early can we see this? What are some of the biological mechanisms by which this is happening? And in particular, got interested in the mechanisms that come online and really refine throughout their early childhood and developmental periods. Of course, there's individual differences in genetics, physiology, and temperament that make a really big difference in variability and the impact of exposures, but I won't be focusing on that today. The other piece that I really like to emphasize in the work that our team does is the relationship between mental and physical health. Mental health is health. That isn't always understood or remembered. They're quite reciprocal, particularly in early childhood. They're very tightly linked. And it's really important for us to understand that there's a lot of transdiagnostic processes happening, and to try not to silo when we're doing this work. And of course, that these things happen developmentally. In a pediatric crowd, I don't have to convince you guys of that. So my work started with an East Bay community sample drawn from Richmond, Oakland, and the Berkeley area back in the early 2000s, 338 kindergarten children enrolled at the beginning of the school year. And it was a really socioeconomically and racially and ethnically diverse sample, which we were very excited about, so that it could be more representative and more informative for the community that it was drawn from. In our early work, produced some of the first evidence that indeed social adversity gets under the skin very early in life. In particular, one of our first papers, we were able to show that family adversity, a composite of things such as conflict in the home, financial stress for the parents, divorce or mental health challenges for caregivers was related to the level, the rise, and the total daily output of cortisol across the day for these kindergarten children. And so was socioeconomic status, in particular, those who are higher in poverty. There was an additional variance accounted for by that. And that the two different types of adversity contexts both uniquely predicted HPA axis function in these kids early in life. And it was one of the first demonstrations of kind of early first straws of allostatic load, which is a very popularized concept around stress and health. We followed that up with evidence using rigorous gold standard paradigms and experimental paradigms with ECG with the kids to show that there's also associations with parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system reactivity and regulation, such as in the pre-ejection period measures in these children, showing changes over the kindergarten year, suggesting a little bit more ability to have some inference around the causality of these associations because it was related to developmental changes. And then a little bit more recently unpacked this with epigenome-wide associations, and I'll just highlight some of those for you guys here. We found that income per dependent, socioeconomic status of the caregivers, parental education, as well as that family adversity composite in the home, each predicted both increases and decreases in epigenome-wide methylation, but more importantly, in marks that are quite related to health outcomes, and in particular, a lot in the immune system activity and function. And more striking and surprising to many people, especially the reviewers, were that there were many more associations for socioeconomic factors than there were for the family adversity, which people have a lot of stereotypes around. Oh, it's the parents, it's the families, but macro level influences tend to be much more powerful. And there was relatively little overlap in those associations, suggestions they all uniquely compound these relationships. But what's less well known is that these processes begin in utero. And that, of course, many of you guys work in this space, there's a lot of development happening, and that social experiences actually get translated through maternal biology to that developing fetus. And the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis is much more popularized now, but when we started the work, it was relatively constrained to looking at factors related to famine and heart disease in adulthood. And that's the Barker hypothesis, which most of us learned about. Was originally thought of as kind of bizarre and unusual, and now is well adopted and has been matured in many ways. But for those less familiar with it, the idea is that the fetus can be born anywhere on the globe. It needs information to help it program its development to be optimized for survival in the environment it's born into, whether that be temperature, taste, nutrition. And if the mother is exposed to a high degree of social stress, it may need to signal to the fetus to develop a high fight or flight response system and a lot of immune system function reactivity to be able to survive once they're born, to procreate, live towards puberty, and keep the genes passed down the lineage. But there can be a mismatch when the programming messaging sent to the fetus doesn't align with a healthy lifestyle as they age, or when there's a lot of overnutrition in the environment, but they thought they needed to store calories. And building on the Barker hypothesis, folks really tried to unpack back in around 2015, this is a very seminal paper, how this happens, focusing mostly on placental fetal communication, biology related to endocrine and immune processes, and focusing a lot, again, on that body composition or cardiometabolic outcomes. But more recently, this has been advanced across a range of outcomes. And in particular, I like this paper by Catherine Monk and colleagues, looking at the many different ways social stress can activate some of these biological processes in maternal, physical, and biological and mental function, how that can operate through a variety of paths to then later affect behavior and developmental outcomes. And although most of these things on the bottom half of this graph were informed largely by animal research, more and more since it's been published, there's evidence in human studies showing that there are quite a lot of placental biological mechanisms through which this process happens. The other piece, before I dig into some more of my data, to have people keep in mind is that often we'll think about stress, but there's so many layers of stress, and for some communities, the layers are particularly compounded. In particular, this is a beautiful paper highlighting the kind of multiple forms of chronic stress that are faced by pregnant people who come from marginalized or socially dispossessed communities. And this can be, for example, for African-American communities, higher levels of individual racial discrimination, racial profiling. It can be community level factors such as exposure to hate crime and racially motivated violence. And it can be more structural level factors such as historical trauma, segregation, the areas you're allowed to live in or have been pressured to be in, and whether there's food availability, quality education to those in your community, et cetera. And so with all that in mind, one of my goals earlier in my career was to advance the limited evidence base that mostly came from European middle and upper class samples to try to get a little bit more of a less weird sample here in the US, and in particular with the patient population that I work most closely with in the community. So I was able here in the Bay Area to follow 180 babies born to women in a pregnancy study that had been run by someone else. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but quite racially diverse group here, also with some variability in socioeconomic status, but predominantly lower income. And in this sample of 180 families, there was quite a high level of maternal stress exposure during pregnancy. And this is indications of different types of stressful life events experienced during pregnancy. And what you'll note here is that in this sample, more than 50% of women had 3 or more different event types. So these are categories. They might have had several of those events within each category. And almost 80% had more than one or more stressful life event. And we were able to demonstrate that the number of stressful life events a woman had been exposed to in pregnancy were associated with objective measures. Using ECG, we found respiratory sinus arrhythmia at rest and reactivity to a standardized stressor protocol, that those who had more stress in their pregnancy, their children were less capable of mounting a parasympathetic response and recovery process in response to those standardized stressors. And that was some of the first evidence in this space. We then looked at rapid weight gain, which is important in its own right, but related to a whole host of developmental challenges and risk for obesity in childhood and adulthood. And we found a pretty striking finding, and that for every one type of stressful life event increase a mother was exposed to during pregnancy, there was a 40% greater odds of rapid infant weight gain in that first year of life. And then working with a medical resident here at UCSF, was able to do medical records abstraction and unpack some of the illness diagnoses of children in this study. And what we found is that the stress during pregnancy was associated with greater numbers of infectious illnesses, as well as non-infectious illnesses. And when we looked at the data, it was not just that certain kids were having certain types of illnesses, but there was myriad illnesses for these kids. They had a greater diversity across a whole range of outcomes. And so looking across these 3 different objective indicators, all very weakly correlated with each other, we find this very distinct pattern of stress being linked to these physical health outcomes very early in life, before disease processes are clear for most kids, and before they meet diagnostic criteria for a whole range of things, but suggesting that they're on their trajectory for health problems. And so our work provided some of the earliest evidence in this space, but I want to put those 2 different chunks of data that I told you about together. As women or pregnant people, we carry forward in our bodies the biological changes from our own childhoods. And so there is this complexity that we have to be thinking about. And women carry their stress from their childhood under the skin in a manner that affects their reproductive biology, as well as their postnatal behavior and parenting. And so we really wanted to understand, well, are they combining? Is one mediated through the other? And so we had to really think about a clever design to do that and unpack some of that. And I needed a much larger sample. And because our data were suggesting that this was consistent across a range of biological outcomes, I wanted to look at many more physical health outcomes in general. And so I was really thrilled to be awarded a 7-year project through the ECHO Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes National Children's Study Consortium. This is, for those of you guys who aren't familiar, a really big, complicated consortium. In short, they took 75 extant individual cohorts that had really high success rates of retention and good data quality across a range of child health outcomes. And we put in these proposals, and some of us collapsed a couple cohorts we were connected to harmonize them. And then those were then collapsed within a larger mega cohort to create 64,000 families with over 100,000 biospecimens from pregnancy and childhood, and then prospectively harmonized data collection. I'm an MPI on one of those awards and was a site award on another. And so I had a lot of opportunity to use those data. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of our findings in that context. So I was MPI of the Echo Pathways study, which leveraged a candle-based study I've been a scientific co-director for about 12 years, as well as the TIDE study. San Francisco is one of a four-site multi-site study from pregnancy, and then a Seattle-based rural and urban cohort called GAPS. And together that gave us almost 2,000 families with harmonized data. And I was able to put in measures that were equivalent across all three of these cohorts. And we found, this is a graph of maternal exposure to childhood trauma, physical and sexual abuse, and interpersonal violence for mom in the home. And you can see the pattern is quite similar across these three cohorts collected at 7 different regions around the state. So it made a lot of sense to combine them. And what we found is that maternal exposure to her childhood adversity in her own childhood predicted a range of outcomes. In particular, we found that it was related to the level and rise of corticotropin releasing hormone, or PCRH, which is a really critical hormone for fetal development and has a really major role in birth timing, as well as associated with fetal outcomes and maternal depression and other behavioral and mental health outcomes. We also found that it was related to maternal pre and postnatal depression over time, and that it had cumulative ongoing contributions over time, not just a single association, but I'll tell you about that in a moment. And we also found that it was related to infant development and behavior. And we used some pretty sophisticated models for some of this. In particular, this is a deeper dive into the Candle cohort based in Memphis, which is, this sample, I believe, is 1,300 women followed from second trimester. And when we looked at maternal report of childhood trauma in her own childhood, we saw that it was associated with her mental health symptoms in pregnancy, but we also had age 1, 2, 3, 4 measures of mental health for her, as well as developmental milestones on her offspring for 4 years. And what we're able to do is demonstrate that there's an initial association operating through maternal well-being and mental health in pregnancy, but that there's a cumulative additive contribution over time, holding constant their maternal depression level during pregnancy. It predicted additional variance in both maternal mental health and child developmental milestones over time. So it's not a one-time effect that operates through one time of mental health or behavior, but it seems to be operating through both pre and postnatal processes, and that it's never too late to intervene and think about it because it continues to contribute variance over time. And using the whole consortium data, mining those 64,000 kids initially, we have a lot of data ongoing, but in the early stages when we were still harmonizing, we were able to find subsets of kids between 2,000 and 4,000 where we could really look at a whole range of physical health outcomes in the same type of model. And what we found is that women who reported histories of childhood maltreatment, it was associated with 54 to 170% increased risk for mental health problems. For example, we found associations with internalizing problems like depression and anxiety in children, but also asthma incidence, autism spectrum disorder, obesity risk, and ADHD. And that for women who reported more than one type of childhood maltreatment history, their kids had an even higher risk of these problems. And so in a larger data set with many more physical health outcomes, many of which were medical records indicated, we're finding this pattern. It's very robust. Almost any data set I test this in, if it's big enough and you have good variability, we're finding these effects. But we still wanted to know, well, do they have independent effects? And so we used our best characterized sample to look specifically at behavioral and mental health problems in children at age 5. And what we found is indeed maternal history of trauma in her childhood, as well as her stressful life events during pregnancy, which were only correlated 0.27. They're not deterministic. One doesn't lead to the other necessarily. It can be correlated, but it's important to know that these are distinct types of adversity and times of exposure. And both of them uniquely predicted differences in children's mental health problems. And when we looked at clinical thresholds, we found for each additional childhood trauma exposure moms reported, there was a 41% greater odds of clinical levels of problems, and similarly a 36% higher chance for pregnancy stressors. And more novel, this had never been shown. I was curious about whether they might interact, whether one might potentiate the other. And indeed, this is a graph showing in the orange for women that have no history of childhood trauma. There's still an association between pregnancy stress and children's behavioral problems at age 5, but that the slope of that association increases for each additional number of childhood trauma in a woman's history, suggesting that that history in her body is potentiating the impact of the stress during pregnancy on that offspring outcome. Trying to get maternal report is great and easier than most things. We try to use objective measures whenever we can, but we were also interested in youth self-report. So we repeated this exposure inquiry at age 9 and the kids looking at their self-report of anxiety. And although maternal history of trauma didn't continue to predict, her stress during pregnancy did. And it also predicted children's self-report on depressive indices. And these were related to clinically significant differences, particularly for anxiety. And then just last month, actually in molecular psychiatry, we were able to work together on a range of placental gene expression analyses with some colleagues of mine in Seattle. And we found that both maternal childhood trauma and pregnancy stress was related to gene expression in several key biological pathways, including the upregulation of protein processing, protein secretion, and amino acid pathways. And accordingly, this really suggests that the placental function is very likely to be one of these things. This type of work has been demonstrated in animal models, but it's very hard to generalize from mice to humans. And so the more we can replicate these types of associations in human samples, the more confidence we have that these are the manner by which these processes are occurring. Our colleagues have also shown that stress relates to the asthma in our own deeper dives with our sample in pregnancy, and then looking at repeated measures of height and weight from birth through age 8, trying to find latent trajectories, profiles of risk for BMI, overweight, and obesity. Again, when we pattern our Memphis-based data, we find that intimate partner violence and neighborhood crime, higher levels of exposure of those types of adversities in pregnancy was related to children being much more likely to be in the high rising BMI trajectory, which we all know is problematic for a variety of health outcomes and mental health for these children. And so a quick recap. I know I'm going quickly. I'm trying to tell the story here more than give you deeper dives on anything, but exposure to stress during pregnancy is related to placental processes and a range of mental and physical indicators related to health in infancy, mental and physical health in early childhood and middle childhood. But pregnant people experience a lot before they become pregnant, and we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to understand these processes. And we're seeing associations with key hormones related to gestation and developmental outcomes for mom and baby, as well as relationships with outcomes across development. And quickly, I just want to highlight that these are the standard types of adversities that I was putting in the literature, but things such as the birthing process or having a baby that is not born at term or born with complications. Any of you guys who work with these populations know this really well. I don't have to sell this audience on it, but it can be an adversity in its own. And we've been able to leverage the ECHO data set. In this paper, we had 11,000 families that we followed pregnancy through age 6. And what we found is indeed for families that had a baby born preterm, they were twice as likely to be in trajectories of maternal depression that were at least mild, if not all the way to severe, and that this lasted through age 5. So we're typically screening for postpartum depression at 2 months, maybe if you're lucky at 6. It's not long enough, particularly for populations that have a lot of challenges in that first year of life. The risk is enduring. And the other piece to highlight is that those trajectories of depression then later are linked to offspring behavioral and mental health. And we haven't published that yet, but you can infer from my other findings that that's probably true. And so what can we do? It's a lot of bad news. I always make people feel sad and stressed at the beginning of my talk, but I'm happy to tell you some good news at the end here. There's a lot of variability in this. Please don't go home and freak out about your childhoods, about your pregnancies, about your patients. We want to do everything we can, but there's a lot that predicts resilience. And I love to show this slide. This is data. As I said, there's that monotonic increase for every increase in ACE. There's a greater risk of health problems. Suspend disbelief about which disease this is. This is a good average plot. For those who have 4 or more ACEs, the risk is highest. And everyone's always focused on this. But what about the folks who have 4 or more ACEs? More than half of them don't have the disease risk that most people are looking at in any given analyses. And so there's a lot of heterogeneity, and there's a lot of hope for a lot of people. And I'd just like to stop and remind us, what are the factors that we can draw upon and amplify that lead to those better outcomes for those of these exposures? And I also love to emphasize that individual ACE scores in a particular patient or person are not very predictive at all. It's not deterministic. And many people who have early life adversity, myself included, live very productive, healthy lives. And so it's really important not to assume or stigmatize. And one of my favorite papers really pointing out this is by Jesse Baldwin and Andrea Danesi and colleagues and JAMA Peds a few years ago. And they really showed that using this national database, very large, on average at the population level, children who experience more ACEs did have a greater risk of mental and physical health problems in adulthood. So replicating everything we always see. But more thoughtfully, they did this beautiful, sophisticated statistics and said, well, for a given individual, looking at their ACE count in childhood, it had a very poor accuracy at predicting which children in particular had a physical or a mental health problem in adulthood. And so it's just a reminder for us, like ACE screening is great, but let's not make presumptions, and also let's not freak everybody out, and let's work at a macro level instead of only the individual level to think about these things. And in our own data, we have evidence from a couple different domains more proximal to the child. When we look at malleable factors to try to understand, well, what might be buffering some of those effects on stress? And I'm going to tell you quickly just about 2 here. In particular, on the left here, we ask parents, what's your knowledge of infant development? We use the kitty. We ask them, do you understand what an appropriate developmental milestone is for your 1-year-old, 2-year-old, whether they have appropriate expectations for walking or emotion regulation, or whether or not they're intentionally spitting out their food to piss mom off at 6 months of age, et cetera. And so what we found is in this lower green slope, for parents who had a little bit above average or higher knowledge of infant development, there was no association between those socioeconomic stressor risk factors in pregnancy and then children's socioemotional behavior. And in a similar pattern, when we did objective coding of caregiving behavior at age 1, 2, 3, 4, and we averaged it, so we have a really robust objective indicator of parental quality and interacting with their child, we find that if you were a little bit above average or higher in your parenting responsiveness and sensitivity, there was no association between stressful life events and pregnancy and behavioral health outcomes in those kids, which I told you was this big effect, right? So heterogeneity in those effects depending on environment. But what about direct intervention? Let's do something active. I had the great privilege of piggybacking on a beautiful study that had been funded by NIH-LBI called the Maternal Adiposity Metabolism and Stress Study. I came in as a postdoc. They had this great quasi-random experimental trial where they were trying to do mindful stress reduction and wellness promotion in pregnant people here in the Bay Area. I'd mentioned it a little bit earlier. And they enrolled 215 pregnant people relatively early in pregnancy. And this is the sample I told you about that I studied the babies on. But here now, I'm going to tell you they were almost randomly assigned to treatment as usual versus intervention based on whether they could show up on a particular night. But otherwise, it was pretty random, and the groups were quite well matched. No differences between groups. And they did 8 weekly sessions, group sessions, where they targeted stress reduction and they improved well-being in these pregnant persons. And they were trying to prevent excessive gestational weight gain. That was the primary motivation of the funder because of its risk for a whole different longitudinal outcomes for those moms. And they use mindful stress reduction, meditation, mindful movement, a little bit of prenatal yoga, nutrition didactics, and mindful eating, but also a lot of social connectedness of these pregnant people. And they had some beautiful immediate effects. So it's been published that it increased mindfulness, acceptance of negative emotion, and ability to regulate emotion, but also it reduced depression and stress immediately in pregnancy, led to increased physical activity and increased glucose tolerance, although no effect on weight gain. So this is that effect I just told you about in terms of the reduction of depression, plotted out here. And then I followed those women, after the babies were born, the parent study ended and seed study started. And I see in the front row someone who helped me launch that. We followed those children for 8 years postnatally. And what was remarkable to us is that that reduction in depression was maintained for 8 years postpartum. An 8-week group-based psychosocial intervention reduced depression for 8 years. And I love this last blip. It was the pandemic. It was a horrible time. Many of you guys remember. I was a little concerned about the validity of our self-report data on maternal depression because the effect was so pronounced, but because everyone increased in depression in response to the pandemic, but the statistically significant difference was maintained, it really increased my confidence in these data. And it's also a clinically significant difference, with only 12% of intervention moms having moderate to severe depression during the pandemic versus 25% of those in the treatment as usual. But was there a 2-generation benefit, which is the whole reason I did that study in the first place? Love moms, but really love the people that they raise. And this is a picture of one of the groups, mamas groups that I told you about, who were there for a baby reunion after birth. And they were incredible. They gave so much of their time and heart and let us do some not very fun things with their babies to get these quality data. And using a standardized paradigm, again, as I mentioned, looking at parasympathetic and sympathetic activity, we found that babies born to women in the intervention demonstrated faster sympathetic reactivity to the stressor, which you want. Something bad is happening. You want a really quick response. You want to engage and be alert and be ready to adapt and respond. But when the stressor was removed, they then showed a very fast recovery back to baseline, and they had no difference after the task that they do prior to the task. However, babies born to treatment as usual had a very delayed response. They actually got stressed at the wrong time, and then they never fully recovered before the end of the observation period. And this pattern of responding has been associated with a range of health outcomes over time, suggesting this is a very early signal of improvement in important ways. And we also coded second by second behavior of the infants during the whole challenge, the stressor, and the recovery period, and found that intervention babies had more self-regulatory behavior, such as thumb sucking and gaze aversion. And they also cried less and were less fussy. And so we're following this up now. This data isn't quite ready, but we also find differences in behavioral and mental health outcomes at age 6, suggesting that we have really important 2-generation impacts on a range of physical, behavioral, and mental outcomes in both the caregivers and their offspring. But what if you didn't catch someone in pregnancy? Sometimes bad things happen. Babies are born. You guys work with the kids after the fact more often than not. I had the great honor of partnering with Alicia Lieberman, who is an international leader in child trauma therapy and developed an incredible child parent psychotherapy program for young children birth through 5 and their caregivers. And there's over 5 RCTs to show that this particular intervention is very effective at reducing child and caregiver symptoms and improving functioning between caregivers and children. And so partnered with her to ask some of these similar types of questions, but in a pediatric context. And in particular, I was really interested in whether child parent psychotherapy might slow trauma-related biological harm or maybe even reverse it. And so we were able to enroll 45 families who received this intensive child parent psychotherapy. They were aged 2 to 6, and we used my existing longitudinal cohort that I told you about earlier, which I'd used all the same measures in, as a community comparison sample. And what we did is they both had the same biospecimen collection over time and a lot of the same questionnaire measures. And so I used some pretty fancy statistics in partnership with my colleagues in Canada and locally to use buccal epithelial swabs or cheek swabs that we collected pre and post intervention. It was about 10 months for the intervention kids and about 1 year for the community sample. And we used a quasi-experimental design, weighted propensity score matching. So we chose children from my community sample that most closely matched the children in the intervention sample. And then we adjusted with weights in case there was any non-matching. And then we calculated an epigenetic age acceleration metric using a pediatric buccal epithelial clock, which some of my data contributed from a different study to developing with my COBR. And I'll explain what that is for those who aren't familiar. The epigenetic clock is a summary score of DNA methylation at levels that are specific sites in the epigenome. And these are reliably correlated with chronological age. And you can estimate someone's biological age relative to their chronological age, that dashed line in the center, is if there's a perfect correlation. If I'm 20 and my biology looks 20, I have a perfect score, right? In some ways, in terms of a one. But if your biological age is higher than your chronological age, and in context of childhood, this might be a 5-year-old just had their 5th birthday, but they look 6 years old biologically, they are considered to have aging acceleration in the epigenetic clock. And the reason this is an interesting metric beyond its kind of curious math is that looking at 69 studies, a review has demonstrated that this age acceleration in the epigenetic clock is correlated with trauma exposure. So very consistent finding across the literature. But more important probably for this audience is that this age acceleration is actually correlated with internalizing, which is depression, anxiety, PTSD diagnosis, reduced brain growth, higher BMI, allergy, and asthma. So it's a really good marker for both tracking trauma exposure and also linkage to later health problems. And so in that weighted samples, looking at my community sample and the intervention sample at baseline, we see no difference between the two groups in epigenetic clock age acceleration. But after roughly a year of treatment, we see a significant difference between the groups, such that the kids in the community sample who have a significant amount of trauma exposure also, they have an aging acceleration that continues, which is what you would expect given the literature that young children who are trauma exposed, their acceleration accelerates as they age because there's no removal of that trauma exposure. Whereas the kids in the intervention had no change over time, over a year. And in fact, they look the same as they had a year earlier. So it suggests that we're able to buffer these children from that biological embedding of trauma, or at least to ameliorate that acceleration in aging. And we were really excited about the kind of press and policy attention that this work got. A lot of the key policy groups who do work in this space really amplified this, and it's been really exciting to see the uptake of the science. And the group, Child Parent Psychotherapy providers, have used this to kind of help bolster fundraising and insurance commitments to supporting their relatively intensive program of intervention that's quite effective. An epigenetic clock is just one type of marker of biological harm related to trauma exposure. I do want to point out, we just finished a review last year with some of my mentees and colleagues here, showing that psychosocial interventions with dyads, caregiver and child, doesn't always have to be mom or biological mom. It can be grandma, it can be foster parent, et cetera. Although most of the studies don't have as rigorous of a prospective model as I just shared with you from our data, there is a lot of data pointing to the likelihood that psychosocial interventions around caregiving or supporting families relate to improved cardiovascular functioning, brain maturation, decreases in inflammation, and a little less clear, because a lot of this data are Wild West still, cellular processes that may be promising. But the bottom line here is that this can help all sorts of outcomes. But I always like to pause and say, I'm talking so much about mothers, pregnant people, caregivers, and families. And that's because that's where my data collection is typically centered. But we have to be incredibly careful not to blame these pregnant people for the ways their history is carrying forward in their bodies, for the stress they're having. We can't tell them, don't be stressed. We can't tell them, oh, you need to find ways to reduce your stress. This is a huge problem in our society, how much pressure we put on pregnant people to solve this problem, which is really leads to a lot of mother blame. And although these origin of chronic disease models around development are really informative and helpful, they've really done a lot of harm in advancing this framework. So I do like to take a little bit of time to remind us that this stuff happens in context. Most people don't choose histories of childhood maltreatment or to be violently abused in pregnancy. And so we have to be very careful about these conversations and remember that these ACEs occur in a larger macro context that are heavily driven by policy and cultural norms in our histories. And in particular, when you're working with patients, we have to keep in mind intersectionality. So it may be that someone comes in with a high level of ACEs, but part of the reason there's a lot of heterogeneity for individuals is that that number doesn't operate in a vacuum. You know, what is their skin color? What is their religion? What is their socioeconomic status? What's their gender identity? What many other myriad contexts are layering on stress and adversity and or providing buffers and protections that help offset that impact on their well-being and on their stress-related physiology. And although I am saying we need to do a lot more work on the macro level context, it's taken a long time to get the field to shift there and to have the data available in large enough samples. And so we are doing this work, and just want to shout out a couple of folks. Luisa Rivera was a CRC here, working on the child parent psychotherapy intervention trial with me. She now just finished her dissertation at Emory, looking at placental epigenetic aging in this space and structural racism at the neighborhood context. Kayla Karvanen, who many of you guys know very well, our local superstar. She has a K23 award on which I'm the primary advisor, and I'm really excited to work with her. She's got some beautiful data that she's working on and findings related to structural racism in preterm birth and child neurodevelopmental outcomes, and then working with a trainee and the doctorate for public health, Saron, over at UC Berkeley, trying to look at children's mental health in this context. So more of the macro level stuff is coming, and it should be out hopefully 2025. But how many generations do we need to consider? So I'm telling you about two. How far back does this go? We know we've got this whole like, well, grandma had the egg inside, that had the egg. Is okay, well, maybe we want to go two. If we're thinking about generations, like how far do we go back? About 400 years. Generations of enslavement and structural racism. What about 500 years of colonialism? We need to more thoroughly consider the impacts of historical trauma and structural violence on Latinx communities. Indigenous people in the Americas have an incredible amount of harm, and we don't have a good relationship with them on any level in terms of research participation. There's very few exceptions to that. But we know from a variety of writings, and many scholars from Indigenous backgrounds do beautiful writing around intergenerational trauma, but we don't know a lot about their physical well-being related to this. Of course, there's concerns about the Holocaust. And in the field of psychiatry, there's been a lot of writing in this space, but it hadn't been focused on prenatal programming. It's mostly around behavioral transmission through anxious behaviors or histories of PTSD, but increasingly looking at the biological embedding for communities with that history. And then, you know, Asian Americans, a rise of anti-Asian American hate in the last couple years, but really has been around for more than 200 years in our country, related to a bunch of challenges in terms of immigrant status or folks who've lived here for many generations experiencing harm. And so this can be considered at a really macro level, and it can get very overwhelming. There's, of course, wars and genocides, and it's kind of everywhere. And it can be really stressful to think about. And yet we have to be thinking in these lenses. We want to understand population health, and we want to understand who's at greatest risk, and understand differences for subgroups in health outcomes, to not presume it's genetic, but to maybe be considering some of the social factors that have been ongoing and compounded over time in those bodies when we're trying to generate understanding of where the origins of these differences in health disparities may come from. So what can we do with this evidence? Well, the good news is, as much of a downer as those last few slides were, we're doing a lot. People are waking up. There's increasing understanding that the childhood onset of health problems is related to a lot of chronic or relapsing problems. And so as a society, we're starting to pay a little bit more attention to pediatrics and early development. And there's a long way to go, as we all know, in terms of our funding or pay for the same service. But we're moving in that direction, and we need to keep, you know, shouting that cry. But we need to evolve our frameworks to be considering these types of intergenerational life course processes when we're trying to do prevention and pinpoint upstream sources to do the prevention of these diseases. And we need better partnership across pediatrics and psychology and public health than we currently have. Published in different journals. It's really fascinating when I try to publish across different fields, how much I have to change everything I write and do. I cannot publish the same thing by any means. Even the analytic approach doesn't work across fields. So it's very tough to get the crosstalk going. But we have to do it if we want to advance this, because there's a lot of learning in these different silos that we need to leverage. And we know a lot. This is a CDC slide from like 20 years ago. We've known for a long time, we need to prevent this stuff. There's things we can do to prevent these things. You know, programs to prevent domestic violence, parenting training, home visiting programs, funding to lift people out of poverty. So we do know this, and depending on policies and administrations, these ebb and flow in terms of their prioritization and funding. But it's been great in the field of medicine, especially in the last few years, and at UCSF, where we lead in this space. And I'm so proud to be on the faculty here with all of you guys. That in healthcare, we can be aware of this. We can work with patients and do our research differently, knowing these things. We can offer assistance and make adjustments for patients with social needs, and we can align with communities and advocate for this policy change. And most people in this room, I know some of you fairly well. I know you're already leading in this space, so I thank you. One of my favorite sources for information in this domain is the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center, which talks a lot about where the evidence base for things with the biggest bang for your buck if you want to make impacts around pregnancy and early childhood. And I do love this website for that. And here, this is an overlay of the California policies and how we're doing. The white boxes with the little state silhouette show where we're doing an okay job, and we're kind of aligning with their recommendations to be investing in this space. And the light teal boxes are places where we're starting to get there. We're starting to meet it. A couple of things I want to highlight in terms of policy advances, or in particular, is a dyadic care benefit, where now if the child is the person on the insurance, but the caregiver doesn't have insurance or has insurance that won't cover care, the dyadic care benefit for Medi-Cal recipients will allow them to receive family therapy, dyadic therapy, maternal therapy, caregiver therapy on the child's benefit. And additionally, the family therapy benefit, and for Medi-Cal, is separate. A family can seek mental health and psychosocial and support services, even if there's no diagnosis. So they can just have had some exposure to adversity, and it could be something such as racism. It doesn't have to be an acute event. They can receive they can receive services that are funded and reimbursed by Medi-Cal. So it's really important. California is moving in the right direction. We also have some really cool San Francisco-based income supplementation programs to support Black and Filipina pregnant people who are birthing. And it's already been really amazing at helping reducing their stress. And then there's a really amazing California ACEs Aware program, and also really cool projects like Find Connect, led by Dana Long over in Oakland, which help understand social determinants and link people to services in the community to address them. And the goal of these policies, ideally, we're preventing adversity, but if it's already happened, trying to make sure that there's equity in people's opportunity to get the help they deserve. And so what's next? In my last few minutes, I'm just going to highlight a couple of things in the works. As I noted, the ECHO consortium just finished 7 years. They're in year 1 of cycle 2, was really happy to be renewed for that next 7 years. What's great for you guys is if you're interested in really large data sets around child health, it's publicly available. All the cycle 1 data is available. You can go to search ECHO children and DASH. Don't ask me, it's all better explained on the internet. But you can apply, and it's a not very heavy lift to have access to their data and put in a proposal to do analyses with ECHO data. And in cycle 2, I've led the charge of adding many more social determinants to the harmonized data collection. This includes things such as pregnancy stress in greater rigor. We added everyday discrimination. We've added measures related to gender identity. We've added fathers data, and we've also added quite a lot around experiences of discrimination and respect within a medical care context, both in the pregnancy period and early pediatrics. So there's lots of things where the data aren't in house yet, but will be coming in the coming years that I think are of relevance to what I shared today. Also partnering with some folks all over the country and in Canada, trying to say, hey, these biomarkers are cool. It's exciting to get these early signals of challenge before diagnosis is clear, but they're hard to get and they don't make sense in primary care. What are we going to do? So working with a lot of pediatric leaders to note that we need something we can use in pediatrics that helps us ascertain who, if they're exposed to ACEs, might be having an under the skin kind of level of concern that we need to prioritize them for services. But also really acknowledging huge histories of harm by science and medicine in low-income and minoritized communities in terms of how do you approach asking for pieces of a baby's biology without a good reason other than just to find out how they're doing. There's a lot of risk about whether they would be turned into CPS if they had a high score, for example. And so partnering with folks as well as community leaders all over North America to unpack this. And right now we're unrolling data collection on 6,000 kids in primary care under the age of 5, where we're trying to collect a whole range of biomarkers to understand which ones are associated with social adversity across these 14 sites. We've only gotten about, I don't know, 500 or 600 families enrolled. We were slowed down by the pandemic, so that was a bummer. But we're starting to do some early work to try to understand which biomarkers are most useful and can practically be assessed in primary care. And then with my partners down at UNC and elsewhere, we're piloting those kind of pediatric-based primary care biomarkers with a home-based caregiving intervention to kind of see whether those biomarkers we are choosing in pediatrics, because they work well in pediatrics, whether they're responsive to intervention and they might be used to track improvement over time. And I've given you a lot of information, but what I often get is, oh, how does this really apply to a pediatrician? What am I supposed to do while you're doing all of that? And I just like to remind folks that pediatrics is amazing. We've been talking about this as a field for more than a decade, saying, hey, we have a role here. We can do something about this. And the ACEs Aware Initiative is a really useful place to start. I want to make sure everyone knows that we can get reimbursed by Medi-Cal for screening for adversity across the life course, and really encourage folks to do that. There's a limited amount of resource to respond to positive screens, and that's a huge problem the state is working on. But the more data we have on prevalence and recognition that this is an issue, and positive conversations with families to acknowledge that it can be challenging related to their health, and encouraging them to seek resources can be very powerful. And then also, I alluded to this earlier, but that we need to recognize and hopefully manage perinatal depression within pediatrics, because it's the best place to capture these moms. And we shouldn't be afraid of it. It's a really amazing, powerful way to help 2 generations. And as I said, the recommendation is to do that up to 6 months, but I think we should be doing it longer, particularly for key populations. And one of my favorite projects here at UCSF is our Precision Medicine California Governor's Office funded project, where I'm working with Dana Long and Nita Thakur and a bunch of other folks at other sites, where we're trying to partner the stress biology and pediatric primary care, and to be screening kids for ACEs using the Pearl screener, but then also providing them with a range of different types of caregiving intervention. For example, in Richmond, we're doing a home-based dyadic intervention. In Oakland, we're doing a primary care-based group-delivered resilience clinic led by Joanne Jung. And in Santa Barbara, they're doing a primary care-based dyadic single family intervention. And we're trying to test like which one works better. How do they relate to biology in these families? And just in case you guys don't know, there's this amazing program. It used to be called CAP. Now there's a bunch of money from California to expand it California wide. And now it's called CalMap. But it provides real-time peer-to-peer psychiatry guidance for primary care providers if they have mental health concerns for their patients and they would like to know, what can I do? How can I particularly do something, or where can I refer them? And it's an incredible resource. And Joanne Jung is a faculty in my division of developmental medicine, has been one of the leaders of this since its inception and does a great job with a lot of that training. So just a shout out to that team for the work they're doing now, expanded all throughout California. And then finally, just to tell you about the Bloom Clinic, for those of you guys who don't know about Black love, opportunity, and outcomes in medicine, Jave Ross and Dana Long had a beautiful brainstorm to create a racially concordant primary care clinic for Black families in Oakland. And they launched it. And I have the privilege with Kayla Carbonen to be leading the evaluation of that racially concordant care clinic with lactation and social work and family groups, so that we can really understand, particularly for families that have so much historic experiences of adversity and racism, does providing care in this context provide additional benefit to those families? And I do have a website in which we've translated all of the work that I told you about, except maybe the things that just came out, into kind of policy-friendly layperson summaries. And we share this with policymakers, and we've been really working on translation to make sure that this message gets out to those who need it most. If you're interested in this work, it's all listed on this website. And I'll also just highlight that I do not do this work by myself. There are so many projects that I'm involved in and so many people that make this work happen. And I just really want to amplify the incredible team that privileges me to share this information with you guys. It's been a long haul for the 20 years here at UCSF, and a lot of people helped me get here. There's also folks all over outside of UCSF who are critical to me doing this work. This is just the Echo Pathways team, so that one MPI project. And this is only half of our team when we came together for an in-person meeting just before the pandemic. And this is my division team who lift me up and do so much to kind of help me do the work I do on a regular basis. And I just want to give them a shout out today too. So thank you.
Amazing work. That's amazing. Your work is so impactful for generations, for the society.
Thank you.
Many questions, but I was so fascinating. You did this 8 weeks and then the impact for up to 8 years of postnatal leave.
Yeah.
But one question is, do you think that is that purely because that 8 weeks the intervention during critical period, or that 8-week intervention modified the lifestyle? They start to practice mindfulness or health diet.
It's a beautiful question. To repeat it, how do we think that mindful intervention in pregnancy is operating for 8 years? Is it a change in lifestyle? So we've been trying to unpack this. Unfortunately, when you pair together 2 different studies funded by different groups for different things, sometimes you don't design it in the way that will help you answer these amazing questions you figure out later. But we didn't track mindfulness practice in the postnatal period because my study wasn't focused on that. And in hindsight, gosh, I wish we had. So we don't know whether they actually changed their practice postnatally around mindfulness or stress reduction. But we do know that it seems to be operating through the initial reduction in depression during pregnancy, because it is the strongest predictor of the later maintenance of reduced depression. And so it does seem to be that reduction during pregnancy seems to prevent postpartum onset. So that's in part. The other piece that seems to be happening is that some of the data suggests that they are practicing mindfulness. So we asked them at age 8, we asked are you doing this? And they are, but it wasn't quite statistically significant. And so, 9 years after the intervention, there wasn't a difference in practice, but we didn't ask it prior to the 8-year outcome. So we don't know for sure, but we're trying really hard to set the study up again in a larger context with a payer here in California to see if we can take this to scale and really dice that and see what kind of economic benefit there might be for this kind of prevention. Thank you for your question.
There's a couple of questions from the Zoom audience.
Okay, I'll let you. Thank you, Sandrine.
This first question is from a little earlier. You were talking about some of the biology. It's from line 1, demethylation recapitulates the effects we really saw in the health plan.
I'm sorry, I can't really hear you.
Speak up. Yeah, I'm gonna let you read it. How's that?
That might be easier. In the mic. In the mic.
Yeah, I'm just. Yes, so someone in the Zoom audience is asking questions about what might be looking into for future analysis around the epigenetic processes. Yeah, Michael Meany is a colleague of mine, and there is a possibility of the glucocorticoid receptor. It's been hard to replicate that particular finding from Weaver and Meany, and so I think the single site stuff is less popular in these smaller samples, but definitely something we can look into. Oh yeah, a question for Dr. Roxanne Almas. Is there any talk around getting more preconception visits reimbursed by insurance like they do in France? So couples can discuss potential risks and even parenting strategies. What a wonderful concept. Yeah, I haven't heard anything about preconception visits being funded, but I do think the more people become aware of this type of evidence base, they'll be thinking more about cost savings. Obviously, I want to do it for the well-being prevention and the physical health prevention. But when you're talking to insurance companies and policymakers, are like, well, how will we pay for this? And our goal is really to set up some trials in the coming year. And we have a few possibilities brewing right now that will help us show the economic benefit of these choices. And that, if you think about it, an 8-week group intervention that's just psychosocial is pretty low cost. If you're thinking of 8 years prevention of depression, and then you see all those signals in the baby biology, like I don't have an economic calculator set up on that trajectory, but it feels like it's probably a good bet. So those are some of the things we're trying to unpack with some policy folks. 1 minute left. You had your hand up first.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Two thoughts. One is, I wonder, based on the question from before, like, is it possible that, and connecting to your earlier work to the effect on the depression, like, the improvement for the baby, like the baby's temperament is they're more emotionally regulated, so then that actually would have effects on maternal depression.
Yes, it's such a great question. So,
Right?
yeah, Naomi Bardak is asking about like, well, wait, maybe the improvement in infant reactivity and regulation is then easier to care for and affecting caregiving and parenting. Yes, so we do look at that in some of our large samples. So our Memphis-based sample where we have 1,500 families over time, we do these cross-lag dyadic transactional models over time, and we can show that whether a baby is easy or difficult in that first year of life really relates to caregiver mental health. It's kind of a no-brainer. And so we think that it's operating both through prenatal programming, postnatal mental health, postnatal parenting, as well as differences in that baby temperament that's eliciting coping mood challenges for caregiving. So it's, that's the beauty of human nature, is it's not this simple path. It's very hard to study though, because it's got 5% here, 2% there. But it's a great question. I mean, that's just one more thing. We'll end on that. This seems to affect a lot of things in a really good way. So hopefully we can invest more money in early. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.